Okay, for learning objective 4, we're going to distinguish between active transport and passive transport. So active transport and passive transport. Passive transport means that a substance can pass through the membrane without any investment of energy. So we have to talk a little bit about energy and what it means to have to invest energy in something. And we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But for now, we need to think about energy in terms of if something just doesn't happen on its own, like going upstairs, it takes more energy to go upstairs than it does to go downstairs. Because when you go downstairs, you've got gravity that's kind of pulling you down. And if you weren't careful, you could just fall down the stairs on your own. But you're not going to fall up the stairs, not all the way up the stairs anyway. So diffusion is the tendency for molecules to spread out evenly into a space. Or think about if you've got a big gymnasium and it's completely empty and you start to let people in and start to occupy seats and stuff. How do they do that? They all kind of spread out. You don't just sort of like, unless there's somebody directing traffic, you're not all just going to go in and sit next to each other. It's kind of going to evenly spread out. Or think about making a bag, making a cup of tea, and you put the tea bag in the water, and the hot water makes the tea particles start to come out of the tea bag and turn your hot water into tea. This is a spontaneous process. The tea particles are going to eventually form a nice uniformly brown cup of tea. And that's an example of diffusion. So molecular movement is random, but diffusion tends to be directional. So the molecules, once they get to that equilibrium point where the tea is uniformly brown, it looks like nothing's happening anymore, but the molecules are still moving. It's just that the rate of movement is uniform in all directions. So I already told you about things that can diffuse just across the plasma membrane: gases, nonpolar molecules, and some water. We can have facilitated diffusion where proteins, transport proteins, can move molecules into or out of the cell. So I mentioned before how your kidney cells need to move a lot of water, and so they can't just rely on the permeability of the phospholipids. In the kidneys, we have special channel proteins called aquaporins, like water portals, that function to move lots of water into and out of cells. Ion channels can open or close in response to something telling them that they need to open and close. Ions, remember, since they're charged, they cannot pass through that hydrophobic fatty acid part of the phospholipid bilayer. So they have to find another way into and out of cells. And as long as they're going with their concentration gradient, so as long as they're going from where there's a high concentration to a low concentration, it doesn't require any input of energy. So what do I mean by that? Here is a channel protein and a carrier protein. So this is just a channel protein. It's not gated at all, but it can be gated like in a carrier protein. So you can see on the outside of the cell, got lots of orange balls, these orange ball molecules. And they will, just by diffusion, flow through to the inside of the cell until there's roughly the same concentration of orange balls inside the cell and outside the cell. So just like the tea is going to become uniformly brown in your cup of tea, the orange balls are going to become uniformly concentrated inside and outside the plasma membrane, and that doesn't require any energy. Same thing with these carrier proteins. As long as they're going with their concentration gradient from an area where there's lots of these orange balls to the outside, or to the other side where there's a lower concentration, it does not require energy. Just like imagine that you've got that gymnasium full of people, getting everybody outside, it's a lot easier than trying to cram more people in once it's already pretty full. Okay, so active transport does require energy. And it uses the energy to move solutes against their concentration gradients. So that's kind of like the situation I was just talking about. Imagine that you're at this gymnasium and it seems like it's totally full, but they're just going to keep cramming folks in there. That's going to require energy because people don't want to be all crammed and smushed together. So facilitated diffusion is passive because the solute moves down its concentration gradient, going from high concentration to low concentration. But sometimes maybe we want to have some ions or something like that that's getting stored in a cell. So you're going to move things against their concentration gradient. So some transport proteins with an input of energy can move solutes against their concentration gradients. So active transport means moving things against their concentration gradient, going from an area of low concentration to high concentration. In order to do that, we have to invest energy, and that energy usually comes from ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is an important molecule for expending energy in the cell. So we have very specific proteins that do this. It's not that you just have you can expend the energy to move any old thing into the cell. These proteins have very specific functions. So if it's a sodium, potassium ion transporter, it's only going to transport those ions in a particular direction. So diffusion, so this is like molecules of oxygen gas can just pass through the plasma membrane, no big deal. You can have a channel protein, so just flowing from where there's lots of these orange triangles to where there's not so many until there's a balance on either side. Or it can be this gated channel, so it doesn't take any energy to gate this channel as long as you're going from high concentration to low concentration. Active transport is going against the gradient. So you can see this as that sodium-potassium ion transporter I was talking about, which is going to move sodium ions outside the cell. So you can see there's not many sodium ions on here, but this molecule is still going to pump them out into the extracellular space. There's not that many potassium ions, these diamonds here, but those are going to get pumped in, and it's going to require energy in the form of ATP to make this particular transporter function. All right, learning objective 5, explain diffusion and osmosis. So we've already been talking about diffusion. Let's make sure that we're totally clear on what that means. So, passive transport is diffusion of a substance across a membrane with no energy investment. Diffusion, as you can see here, is the tendency for molecules to spread out evenly into an available space. And because the molecules are just going to move. They're always in motion. They're going to bump into each other, and so they're naturally just going to spread out. until something impedes them from spreading out. And even when that happens, they're still going to be bumping into each other, but at equilibrium, you can't tell that they're moving anymore because your tea is not going to get any more brown. The particles in the solution will just keep bumping into each other. They're still moving, but it doesn't look like anything's happening because it's come to equilibrium. So at dynamic equilibrium, as many molecules cross the membrane in one direction as in the other. So here we've got a semi-permeable membrane. There's water on both sides, and say we've got these molecules of dye or tea or something like that that can move across the membrane. So because there's a higher concentration over here than there is on the right side, they're going to start to diffuse across that membrane. And the net diffusion is going to be from left to right. So some period of time passes. Some of those orange dots are going to get over to the right side. And then eventually, there's going to be as many of the orange dots on one side of the membrane as on the other. They're going to keep moving around, but the net rate of orange balls moving from left to right is going to be the same as them moving from right to left. And that's what we call equilibrium. Same concentration on either side of this membrane. What if we had two different solutes? Well, the same thing's going to happen in both directions. So if we start with orange on one side and purple on the other side, you can see even though the concentration of purple is lower than the total concentration of orange, there's going to be net diffusion in both directions. And at equilibrium, the concentration of orange is going to be the same on both sides, and the concentration of purple is going to be the same on both sides. So no matter what, there's going to be more orange on either side than purple. So more orange than purple on the left, more orange than purple on the right, but the concentration of orange is the same on left and right, and the concentration of purple is the same on left and right. So through diffusion, you could have all the solutes in here, and it could be very complicated, but at equilibrium, there's going to be equal proportions of each solute on either side of the membrane. Okay, so osmosis is diffusion of water across a membrane, a selectively permeable membrane. So water is going to diffuse from the region of lower solute concentration to the region of higher solute concentration until solute concentration is equal on both sides. So imagine in this example that these particles cannot cross that membrane, but water can. So water is going to eventually come to equilibrium by diluting whatever solute particles are on a particular side of that membrane. And water can even be made to do some work through osmosis. So here we've got a tube in the shape of a U, the letter U, and we've got two different concentrations of sugar, which is our solute, in the solution. We've got a selectively permeable membrane that doesn't allow the sugar to pass through, but it does allow the water to pass through. So what's going to happen is water is going to move from the area of lower concentration to the area of higher concentration. And after some period of time, you can see what's happened to the water in the tube. It's gotten lower on this side, it's gotten higher on this side. Why? Because osmosis is a force that's going to drive this this pair of reactions to equilibrium. So now, when the equilibrium has been reached, you can see the concentration of sugar on this side of the tube is about the same as the concentration on this right side of the tube. So not as concentrated over here anymore, because the water has made the concentration the same.